and welcome to our third session of today on the study of peasants in the near past. Our session now is on texts, materials, and the peasantry of Palestine. Before we go any further, I would like to thank Amos for inviting me to this conference, and also to congratulate Amos for what I thought was an outstanding presentation early on this afternoon. Yesterday evening, when the conference began, Professor Popkin, in his keynote address, spoke about the peasants and outsiders. Our session now deals very much with the peasants and the outsiders on a number of different levels, from the outside in and from the inside out. The economic, commercial penetration from Jaffa into the rural countryside, the connections between the rural peasantry of Palestine and the Ottoman capital in Istanbul, and the Arab rebellion of the 1930s, where the peasants were key players in the struggle against the British, the Zionists, but also internally within Palestinian society, the tension between the peasants and the urban mercantile elite. We have 3 speakers, and they will, I suggest, speak one after the other in succession, each for 20 minutes or so. That will leave us time for some Q&A at the end. Our first speaker is Professor Mahmoud Yazbak, a renowned scholar on the history of Palestine, formerly the president of the Middle East and Islamic Studies Association of Israel, also formerly the head of the Department of Middle Eastern History at the University of Haifa, has published extensively, and 2 books I would mention in particular: Haifa in the late Ottoman period, 1864 to 1914, a Muslim town in transition. And a second book more recently, which at the moment is only in Arabic, Medinat al-Portugal, Jaffa, Khadara wa Mujtama, the City of Oranges, Jaffa, Culture and Society. And this book tells the story of the rise of Jaffa as a key coastal city of Palestine, the port of entry into central Palestine, and the fact that Jaffa was blessed with fertile land and abundant water resources also gave it very prominent sources of wealth. And this leads us right into Professor Mahmoud Yazbak's lecture, The Beginning of Urban Capital Penetration to the Countryside Around Jaffa in the 19th Century. So Professor Yazbak, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Asher. It's really good to be here, and also to see friends of mine, which I haven't seen for long. Amos is a good friend, but we didn't meet so long, but this time we meet without touching each other. I hope that we can touch in the near future. However, how much time I have? Is 20 or 30 minutes?
20.
Yeah, good. Well, as you mentioned, Professor Sasser, it's, the title is Penetration of Urban Capital into the Palestinian Countryside, and the case study is Jaffa in the 1830s. Well, as you said, Jaffa emerged from the beginning of the 19th century as Palestine's vibrant economic and cultural center. It attracted migrants from different Palestinian areas and from elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. especially from Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria. Capital owners in Jaffa invested heavily in citrus groves, especially the well-known Jaffa oranges. Also, soap factories and sesame presses attracted many merchants to invest heavily in these branches. These factories depended entirely on raw material, which is olives and sesame, heavily produced in the countrysides. Big merchants and entrepreneurs, capital owners in Jaffa, who invested in these branches, built wide and complicated economic networks in the countryside to ensure a steady flow of raw materials to their factories. The need for raw materials of Jaffa's capital owners pushed them to penetrate into the economy of the countryside, making it part of the city's economic orbit. As the global markets approached the Palestinian countryside through the city's merchants, the olive tree has transformed from being a source of self-sufficiency and local consumption into a marketing commodity and a source of investment, and a means of using urban capital to control the embryonic economic structure of the Palestinian countryside. The results of this transformation will be further clarified in the coming decades when large rural properties would be appropriated by the city's merchants. As a result, a new class of peasants emerged with no agricultural means of production and turned into low-skilled laborers outside the village boundaries and on the outskirts of the city. The economic importance of Jaffa, as well as of other coastal towns in Palestine, increased rapidly from the beginning of the 19th century. This brought about more opportunities for investment for urban capital owners, mainly big merchants. The penetration of urban capital in the countryside was one opportunity. In the Jaffa hinterland, the primary mechanism for that penetration was money lending system, which offered immediate cash to peasants against the future delivery of agricultural produce. This arrangement benefited both parties as the urban merchants accumulated considerable capital and was in need of agricultural surpluses for their factories and marketing activities, while the countryside was in constant need for cash. The merchants' capital invested or borrowed by the Fallahin was guaranteed through legal contracts. As elsewhere, Jaffa's merchants preferred to lend money through two systems. The one is called salam in Arabic, which is meaning advanced purchases or deferred credits. And the other system was called bay' wafa in Arabic, that means insured sales. It was through the contracts of these two money lending systems that much of the agricultural surpluses were appropriated by merchants from both individual peasants and entire villages. This paper discusses how the borrowing system worked and who used it and how it facilitated the penetration of urban capital into Palestine's countryside. Well, the expansion of commercial capital into Palestine's rural area began long before the 19th century, as we know, but its effects manifested themselves most clearly after the Egyptian invasion to Bilad al-Sham in the 1830. Note that during the Egyptian rule in Palestine, there appeared in Jaffa's Sharia court records in the Sijil new financial transactions and commercial relations that had not been seen in the Jaffa Sijils before. This is fact. The most important of these transactions is the salam contracts. Well, the salam contracts became common when the big urban merchants found it necessary to secure certain quantities of agricultural produce before the harvest season. At the same time, the fallahin needed cash. The principle of the salam contract was that the first party, that means the merchant, paid cash immediately upon the conclusion of the contract against the promise of the second party, the fallah, to deliver the sold commodity on a later date and at the agreed price. The salam contract required that the commodity, usually crops, be delivered to the first party in kind, regardless of its market price in the harvest season. According to the balance of power between the two contracting parties, it is believed that the salam contracts involved a significant proportion of concealed interest that guaranteed the profit to the lender even if market prices fell below the expected level. Apparently, the merchants of Jaffa registered several salam contracts in the Sharia court records after contracting the terms of the salam contracts somewhere outside the court, usually at the merchant's office. The price changes with the length of the salam period. The longer the period between the signing and the delivery of oil, for example, the lower the price of the oil jar. However, that means the interest is higher when the period of the salam is longer. On several occasions, the salam contract included a statement that this is a righteous and legitimate salam contract free of interest and meets all legal conditions. Everybody would sign this, but it's a big lie, as we say. In fact, this statement was disingenuous, as proved by the salam contracts in which the price of oil changed according to the different period. It is clear that oil prices usually rose at the beginning of the harvest. In order to prevent competition between owners of soap factories in the high olive picking season, they sought to secure a large amount of oil, to the soap factories several months before the season. It seems that the salam contract have become a common phenomenon in Jaffa during the Egyptian rule, designed to increase the quantities of soap exported to Egypt due to the increased demand for this commodity. However, the farmers in Jabal Nablus and Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Hills, had long been accustomed to the salam system before Jaffa's merchants and soap factory owners penetrated these areas. The prices of olive oil and the salam contracts depended on several factors, the most important of which was the intensity of competition among merchants to secure their oil, which led to the improvement of the farmers' bargaining terms. The farmers' demand for cash and their available network with urban merchants also played an important role in determining the price of the oil jar. It is clear from the contracts that the prices of the oil jar differed not only according to the length of the term, but also according to the intensity of the competition between the urban merchants and the farmers' need for cash. It is worth noting that all the salam contracts for olive oil contracted by merchants from Jaffa during the period of the Egyptian rule were signed only with farmers from the villages of the mountains of Jerusalem. No salam contracts between merchants from Jaffa and farmers in Mount Nablus, Jabal Nablus, appeared in the Jaffa Sigil during the Egyptian rule. perhaps because of the social alliances in the area. The Nablus elite controlled the surrounding countryside, preventing Jaffa's merchants from penetrating this area. Conversely, the villages of the Western Jerusalem mountains, located near Jaffa, appear to be less controlled by the interest of Jerusalem's elite. This fact has facilitated the economic penetration of Palestine's coastal merchants to those villages, linking them to a new economic system based on cash flow from Jaffa to convert olives, the most valuable product in the Palestinian mountains, into soap for domestic consumption and export. The Salam contracts in this period refer to two important issues. First, the economic base of the city of Jaffa, which has grown steadily since the end of the 18th century and has become in the 1830s an important productive and investment power that transcended the city limits. Second, the big merchants and capitalists, especially the owners of the soap factories and sesame pressers, succeeded to penetrate rural, coastal, and mountainous areas to invest in it and develop direct economic networks. During the 1830s, the Egyptian government bought large quantities of soap, especially from the merchants of Jaffa, to supply its military requirements, which led traders to secure ample quantities of oil to provide the Egyptian army. The court records, the sigillat, during that period also include Salam contracts for agricultural crops other than olive oil, namely sesame and cotton. It seems that in this period, the demand for sesame oil in the Egyptian market in particular increased, pushing owners of sesame presses in Jaffa to seek more Salam contracts. Just as before the period of the Egyptian rule, we did not find any olive oil Salam contracts in Jaffa Sharia court records. This record did not contain any Salam contracts for sesame. The first of these contracts appeared in 1836 and was initiated by somebody called Muhammad al-Dimyati. Dimyati, yani, he is originally from Dimyat, a city, a port city in Egypt. And Dimyati has invested in Jaffa, and in 1836, he signed 4 Salam contracts related to sesame. These contracts included farmers from different villages in the vicinity of Jaffa and Bedouin farmers from the area nearby Gaza. And we also found in the same sigil of 1836 another contract of cotton Salam was signed between merchants from Jaffa and farmers from the village of Tulkarim to the north. The terms of the Salam contracts for these commodities are not different from the Salam contracts relating to olive oil. The period of sesame Salam contracts range between 4 to 5 months, usually starting in mid-May, and the commodity was delivered in September at the end of the harvest season. All Salam contracts stipulated that the agricultural product should be delivered to Jaffa at the merchant's place. Usually, transportation costs were paid by the merchant or factory owner. Owners of soap factories and sesame presses also contracted with the owners of transport animals in order not to give the peasant an excuse to delay the transfer of their products to Jaffa. And the other subject is money lending, the contracts of money lending. Interest, as you know, was not a stranger to the Jaffa community, even in simple financial transactions. A debt contract referred clearly to usury, despite the fact that everyone was aware of its illegitimacy. A case in the Sharia court law dealt with a loan of 700 kurush, borrowed by somebody called Hussein al-Liddi from Lid, from a woman called Amna al-Masri. The case says that after 1 year, she came to the court, this woman, and asked for 800 kurush. That means she added 100 kurush as interest. And of course, the court, because she used the term, the court sent her out, you are not allowed. So everybody was careful not to include the term faida or interest when they have these contracts. So they will use different ways how to include the interest. In fact, salam contracts were one of the ways of contracting between farmers and merchants of the city, which facilitated urban capital penetration and in rural areas and linked their economy with that of the merchants in coastal cities. Since the 1830s, the big merchants contracted with world trade markets and met growing European and regional demand for Palestinian agricultural products such as olive oil, sesame pearl, wheat, and oranges. These commodities were affected by price fluctuations due to supply and demand changes imposed by the city market, especially in Jaffa, whose economy became gradually linked to the global economy. This trade transformation produced a new class of merchants with relations to the European consuls, ensuring foreign protection. Christian merchants, in particular, occupied a powerful position by developing a complex network for socio-political and financial relations. During the period of the Egyptian rule, a certain Mikhail Israfim became a big merchant in Jaffa. His career represents a model of social and economic change in Jaffa, especially the penetration to the Palestinian countryside. The salam contracts were not the only way in which Kostandi and Mr. Israfim penetrated the countryside. In his commercial dealings with the Fallahin, he also used the direct lending method, with contracts imposing hidden and high interest, ensuring control over the price of olive oil and linking a large group of farmers to his economic networks. From March 15, 1837, and for a whole month, the registrar of the Sharia, the registrar of the Sharia court in Jaffa was occupied documenting and editing more than 70 legal loan contracts for Mr. Israfim. Yani the Sharia court was busy for the whole month doing nothing but contracting these 70 contracts. You just imagine what work he had been doing there. These documented the amounts lent, the interest rate, the names and villages of the farmers, and the witnesses. All of the loan contracts concluded by Mr. Israfim expired in January or December, the season of olive picking and pressing. Although olive oil was not mentioned in these contracts and nothing was mortgaged against the loan, as was the case in the other salam contracts, it was clear that the date of repayment was tied to the olive pressing season when the farmers sold their products to merchants from Jaffa, perhaps also to Israfim himself. Well, the loan contract contracts pose a set of questions. How did Mr. Israfim, for example, ensure repayment? Where was the benefit hidden in this legal loan? Is this really a legitimate loan? What is the role of the witnesses in this contract? Usually 77 witnesses signed each of these loan contracts. In one day, 10 such contracts were registered in the Jaffa court. For each of these, contractors and witnesses attended in the courtroom, meaning that the courtroom was filled with people from different social backgrounds who came to register the loan contracts of Khawaja Israfil. We can imagine a crowd of more than 100 men standing in front of the court, and how this affected a small city like Jaffa in the 1830s. This crowd testified to Israfil's socio-economic power. It is also important to imagine the logistics involved in bringing these crowds from different places to Jaffa and pay the farmers in cash. The process could not have been organized on the same day had Israfil not had agents spread in the various villages to contact the peasants and network them with the Khawaja Israfil himself. Some of the loan documents refer clearly to village elders or to sheikhs, heads of the villages of the sub-district Nahya, or as a borrower or as selling his produce to Israfil. In fact, Mr. Israfil succeeded to build up his network with Palestine's rural area through the influential rural leadership, and through them also he secured his loans in full and ensured its payment on time, including the interest. In addition to the village dignitaries, the names of the witnesses included many of the influential religious and social personalities in Jaffa itself, attesting to Israfil's influence among the town's social elite as well. Studying the pattern of financial lending this period through 70 lending operations by Israfil shows that the hidden interest rate was 20%.
Professor Mahmoud, could you move to conclusion, please?
Yes, please. 1 minute. Well, the interest was 20% on the total amount for a period of 10 months. And this is very high. And you can see that not everybody could pay such high interest. And as I need to reach conclusion, so let me say here for conclusion that the injection of urban capital into the countryside through credit and debt and the accompanying interest and accumulation of debt, the year-on-year transfer of this debt and the imposition of fines on areas necessarily led to the loss of many farmers' means of production and livelihood, even in this period preceding the Ottoman legal transformation or Tanzimat, which were responsive to changes in the local market and world trade, such as the land law of 1858 and the Vilayets law of 1864, and many other legal changes until that day. And at the end, the process, when it continued after the 1830s and moved after the 1850s and 60s, the result which we reached in the 1880s, 1890s, that many villagers, many fallahin, were only fallahin without their lands. Their lands have already started to move to the ownership of the big merchants, whether in Jaffa, whether in Nazareth, whether in Haifa, whether in Nablus, in different cities. And this situation will affect the situation of the fallahin, the political situation of the fallahin in the later years, which I believe that Yuval maybe will touch it in this in his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a really outstanding presentation, very enlightening. And we move to our second speaker, Dr. Shlomi Chetrit. Shlomi Chetrit heads the Israeli Police Heritage Center and is a postdoctoral researcher at the Criminology Institute at the Hebrew University. His research focuses on the history of law enforcement and internal security organizations in Israel-Palestine, and his PhD dissertation, The Biggest Small War, examined the British Army's counterinsurgency campaign in Mandate Palestine, 1936-1939. The topic of Dr. Shlomi Chetrit's presentation is the physical remains from the Arab revolt in Palestine, 1936-1939. Dr. Shlomi Chetrit, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Sasser, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this conference for having me. I will try to share the screen. I hope everything will work as planned. Okay. So I think you are able to see my presentation, right? Great. Okay. So I'm not an archaeologist, although I did study in the Department of Eretz Israel Studies and Archaeology in Bar-Ilan University. That's where I researched both my graduate thesis and my PhD. And I focused mainly on military and paramilitary history of Mandate Palestine and Israel. And the question which I try to answer is, what remained? What can we learn through archaeology from the Arab revolt in Palestine? Now, this caricature, which was published in Britain's Punch on October 1936, sums up the Arab revolt quite nicely. We see the three belligerent sides: the Arab insurgent, the Jewish settler, which are of course at odds, and Tommy Atkins, the quintessential British soldier who protects the Jewish settler from the Arab. That's how the British press presented the struggle, and we can see the caption, "Order first," or "The problem of Palestine." The Arab asked the British, "Where do I come in?" Presumably in the new order of things in Mandate Palestine. And the British Tommy answers, "We'll see about that, mate, but this is where I do," meaning that if the Arab uses force against the Jew, it's the British duty to prevent him from causing harm. So what was the Arab revolt in Palestine? We're talking about an event which lasted for about 3.5 years, with almost a year of relative quiet between October 36 to September 37. It was a widespread insurgency against the British Mandate government in Palestine by the Arab population. It included both civil disobedience, protests, and military activities. And it should be noted that this was the most extensive British military campaign during the interwar period, with the exception of perhaps the Irish-British War, 1920-1921. The largest expeditionary forces used by Britain throughout the interwar period were here in Palestine. At 2 times, they had an army corps deployed in Palestine, between 12,000 to 15,000 troops. What characterized the Arab revolt? It was, as I said, a very widespread guerrilla warfare throughout the land, mainly in the hilly areas, the Galil, the Carmel range, Samaria, the area around Jerusalem up to Hebron. Most engagements were very, very small scale, between a dozen or so insurgents and small British patrols. Very rarely we've seen larger engagements. And as we shall see, there was an extensive use of fortifications by the British, mostly of a temporary nature. And here, for example, we see a very rare photograph taken by the insurgents during one of the largest encounters of the revolt in September 1936, the Battle of Bal'a, between insurgents under the leadership of Fawzi ad-Din al-Kaukji, who came from Iraq at the time, against the British. But such open combats were relatively rare. Most of the engagements were either ambushes on the roads, and here we can see the outcome of one of them to a convoy of the Palestine Potash Company on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem, sniping attacks, sabotage to the railroads, to the IPC, Iraqi Petroleum Company, pipeline, assassination attempts against British officials, British security members, Arab policemen, Jewish civilians, and Arab opponents of the leadership of the revolt. And also terror attacks, the most notable one being Tiberias night, Leil Tveria, on the night between the 2nd and 3rd of October 1938, when 19 Jews, of them, if I'm not mistaken, 11 children were massacred by Arab insurgents during a raid on a Jewish neighborhood in Tiberias. Who were the belligerents? On the Arab side, we had insurgents. They were organized in small bands or guerrilla units, which were called gangs or bands by the government, knufiot, gangs by the Jewish community, and who called themselves mujahideen. They were predominantly local Muslim peasants. There was relatively a minor urban component to the guerrillas, and there were also Bedouin tribesmen who were very well represented in the revolt, and some foreign volunteers, either long-term or short-term, small groups who came mainly from Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, raided, attacked, and returned to the security of French Mandate Syria. On the British side, with the British Army, with the Royal Air Force, who until 1936 was responsible for internal security in Palestine, the mostly Arab Transjordan Frontier Force, and again, the mostly Arab Palestine Police Force, which throughout the events was greatly reinforced by Jewish auxiliaries called Notrim, or supernumerary policemen. Almost all of them were also Haganah members, which the British were pretty well aware of. So what can we find? Looking for remains of an insurgency is very difficult, and I think that we will see why. The things that we might find which relate to the Arab Revolt are mainly destruction levels in settlements which were affected by the revolt, the remains of British military fortifications, pickets or posts, the remains of British security roads, remains of arms, ammunition, and all kinds of miscellaneous, uniform fragments, trash, etc. And lastly, human remains. The British used extensive punitive demolitions against the Arab population. I've counted about 1,300 documented cases of house demolitions from 1936 to 1939, mostly during 1938. There were two major events, one of them Jaffa, Operation Anchor, in June 1936, in which 237 houses were demolished, and another in Jenin in August 1938, which was apparently a very massive operation. I don't know the exact number. The only British source cites the number of 400 houses, but such, even if it didn't, if there weren't 400 houses, it was apparently a very extensive operation, which surely left its marks on the city. There were some villages who also were very drastically affected. Irtach, Bakr al-Arbiya, Kfar Yassif, Al-Basa were at a time demolished. The British cite figures of 50% of the houses in a certain village were demolished by them in an operation. Here we see a picture from the demolition of Jaffa on June 17. There are many photographs of that city, and Yuval in 2007 found remnants of this operation. By the way, they can still be seen even without excavations. If you go around the old city of Jaffa, you can see houses broken down in what became later Hashetach HaGadol, the great territory of Jaffa, that used to be the Kasbah, the old town, which was demolished by the British Army. The pickets or the posts were the main defensive and offensive element of the British army during the revolt. They were tasked with keeping the peace in a certain area to protect a nearby communication line or infrastructure, and to prevent the insurgents from operating in a certain village or villages. There were about 50 permanent pickets, meaning pickets or posts which operated for a few months at least, some of them up to 2 years. Most of them operated in Samaria and the Galil, and we can see from this map of the Royal Ulster Rifles Regiment of 1938 how those pickets commanded and protected the northern road from Acre to Safed. Some of them were within Arab villages. Some of them were adjacent to them. The idea was to enable control of the area. By the way, this method is still used today by the British Army and American Army in Afghanistan. It's called the oil spot strategy. The idea is that every detachment in such a local post will exert its influence in a wider and wider area until, like an oil spill, they will converge and will pacify the entire area. Here we have a typical, relatively small picket from Samaria in 1936, and it is it has an outer wall built of field stones. Where there weren't stones, the British used sandbags. We can see here a sangar, a fortified firing position, also from field stones. The tents where the soldiers lived. This shed apparently was either the latrine or the cooking, the kitchen, the field kitchen. And here we have the picket identification number 15. In this case, it's on the side. This was used in order to allow Royal Air Force airplanes to identify the picket and to use them as a navigational aid. Another picture of a picket near Jenin shows us a double wall, which was, by the way, according to British regulations. The previous picket was not built according to regulations, and a wire fence, which also was supposed to envelop each picket. I presume that we can still find the remains of such pickets throughout Samaria, at least, if not in other places. Sometimes, like I said, they were built inside villages. Here in Shab, we can see what was then the village's school, used as a makeshift military post. Speaking of archaeology, this is Pillar Post near Silat Adaher. This picture was taken in late 1938, and it was called Pillar Post due to this ancient pillar, which was found during the 1960s, and it was published in the Palestine Explorations Quarterly of 1917. And we can see that it bears a Latin inscription, but when you read the inscription, then you see that it was actually carved by the British soldiers in 1936 from the Seaforth Highlanders as some kind of a private joke. This pillar was still on that hill overlooking Silat Adaher in the early 1980s. It had since disappeared. So if anyone knows about its whereabouts, I would love to hear about it. Another major component of British strategy during the revolt was the building of security roads in order to enable military forces to access villages in the hilly areas. Forgive me for putting the map of Mandate Palestine on its side. It's not very easy to show things on the map of Israel when it's the right side up. But this is the roadmap, the government roads in 1936. This is the same map in 1940. All the orange ones are British security roads paved during the revolt. That's the main infrastructure for today's Israel road, by the way. You can see Kvish Abika, the road number 90, number 38, 35, 70, 65. You can see there are many, many, many roads, mainly throughout Samaria, Judea, the Galil, from Jericho to Bisan, etc. These roads were soling roads. They were composed of three distinct layers: a subgrade of crushed stone, soling stones, which were placed by hand, and a metalling layer of crushed stone and earth, which enabled vehicles to drive on them. And here we can see them being laid. All these roads were built by Arab peasants, either recruited or impressed to service according to the village works ordinance, which forced them to work, but provided them with monetary compensation, or were simply forced to work. And here we can see a very typical picture from a British regimental journal explaining exactly how the roads were built. For the British, there were two main goals for this road building. First, of course, to improve mobility, but second, to have the young Palestinian Arab men occupied in road building and not in fighting the army. This is the remains of one such soling road. I don't think it was paved during the revolt. I think it was a little bit later, but we can see the soling stones here. This was taken near Revolt, and it was laid during the mandate, but I think during the Second World War, not the revolt. We can expect to find weapons and ammunitions, and we can see here a list, I won't go through it, of typical armament of the revolt. And in 2007, Yuval, during rescue digs in the Kishle in Jaffa, the old police station, found a weapon stash dated to the Arab revolt. These were mostly rifles captured from insurgents and interred there in order to destroy them. And here we see a typical insurgent gun. This is a First World War vintage German Mauser or Turkish Mauser rifle, which was very widely used by the insurgents. As for ammunition, we will find mainly British and German or Turkish ammunition. We will find hand grenades, meal bombs. We will find IEDs, improvised explosive devices, mortar shells and fragments, and light artillery shells and fragments. The British rarely used anything heavier than 2 and 3 pounder artillery, which were anti-aircraft artillery used against the insurgents. These three shells, by the way, cases are interesting. I found them at Khirbet Midras. According to the head stamps, these two, which were produced in Turkey, were produced in 1912, Hijri Kir 1331. And this one was produced in Germany. Now, this shows one of the problems. I have no way to date the actual use of these cases. It was somewhere after 1912, for sure. But when? 36, 34, 39, 48, or even later, I cannot be sure.
Shlomi, can you move to conclusion, please?
Yes, of course. Okay, so here we see the British Mills bomb and its fragments. And before I conclude, I think that the only remnant which we can actually point to being created by the insurgents themselves are human remains. One of the things that insurgents did was to abduct either Jews or mainly Arab opponents of the rebellion. They were usually killed, and then the bodies were disposed of in caves or cisterns or dried wells. Some of them weren't found until today. The Lazarovich family were found by the police in 1963 after a very interesting investigation. And here we can see the story of 2 police officers who were abducted and, as far as I know, were never found. The main challenges are, first and foremost, identifying the battle sites. Even when the British report where an engagement took place, they never give the exact coordinates. It's very difficult to date the finds because the military equipment used in the revolt was used either earlier during the First World War or later during the Second, during the 1948 war, and sometimes even until the 1960s and 70s. Arab villages changed after 1948. Many were demolished. Many grew and were built. And the infrastructure, the road also changed. And I think that this last document shows a very similar case. This is from a British intelligence report from 1939, which actually compares the Arab revolt with the Bar Kokhba revolt, with the British, of course, identifying themselves with the Romans, not with the Jewish insurgents. And like the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was the stuff of legends until the underground complexes were found during the 1980s and later, the Arab revolt, without doubt, will not leave much for archaeological research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shlomi Chetrit, very interesting indeed. And now we move to our last presentation. Professor Yuval Ben-Bassat from the University of Haifa. He is head of the Department for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of Haifa, where he has been teaching Ottoman and Turkish history since 2007. He received his PhD in 2007 from the University of Chicago, and his research focuses on Ottoman petitions, Ottoman maps, Greater Syria in the 19th century, the rural population of Palestine, the early Jewish-Arab conflict, Gaza during the late Ottoman period, and the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. Ben-Bassat is the author of Petitioning the Sultan, Protests and Justice in Late Ottoman Palestine, and that leads us directly into his presentation on approaches to Istanbul by the rural population in the central and southern coastal region of Palestine at the end of the 19th century. Professor Ben-Bassat, the floor is yours. You must unmute, Yuval. Yuval, unmute.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Sasser, and thank you, Amos and Yuval, for inviting me to participate in this conference. I will focus mainly on Gaza today with some reference to Jaffa. Two main groups lived in the peripheral hinterland of late Ottoman Palestine, peasants and Bedouins, both semi-nomads and nomad Bedouins. As those two marginal groups that demographically constituted the majority of the population had a limited tradition of writing and documenting their activities, it is very difficult to learn about their aspirations, whereabouts, concerns, and deeds from first-hand accounts as compared to the more educated urban population that had closer contacts with the centers of government and rule and left a variety of written evidence behind. Not surprisingly, peasants and Bedouins are often considered to be on the sidelines of events and secondary players in a game whose rules were dictated from the outside or above, particularly in an area such as Palestine with its turbulent modern history. The southern coastal plain to the northeast of Gaza was heavily populated by dozens of villages whose economy was based on grain farming. It is estimated that on the late 1870s, the population of the Gaza, the sub-district of Gaza, which was part of the province of Jerusalem, stood at circa 55,000 people, of which some 16,500, or about 30%, lived in Gaza itself and the rest in the rural area around it. The villages were headed by elected muhtars, who served as the official representatives of the Ottoman bureaucracy in the provinces, despite being at the lowest junior rank. For the most part, the Mukhtars came from families that controlled village life and had greater financial and administrative clout. Some villages had more than one Mukhtar, a fact which reflected the size of the village and its social divisions. Semi-sedentary Bedouin groups too had to elect Mukhtars. Now, it is often claimed that the rural population did its best to avoid contacts with the government, with governmental representatives because it feared taxation, conscription, retribution, and similar acts by government representatives, and thus made efforts to run its own affairs as much as possible and settle its internal disputes and strifes alone. To a certain extent, the numerous petitions that one can find in Istanbul in the Ottoman archive submitted by the rural population contradict this assertion and reveal a wealth of information about the rural population. Despite the potential of this untapped source, it is first worth inquiring into its value, given that those individuals could not write petitions alone. Some researchers, in fact, view the whole genre of petitions to the ruler as no more than literary works which are informative as to the rules of petitioning or petition writing and the discourse authorized by the state and the rulers, rather than as a reliable historical text with authentic information. When it comes to the illiterate subaltern populations, the situation is obviously even more complicated. Yet, as John Shalcraft has convincingly argued regarding Egyptian peasants in the 60s and 70s, 1860s and 70s, I quote, instead of the complete erasure implied in the claim that the subalterns cannot speak, peasants arguably did convey elements of their moral economy through their petitions, especially by manipulating the meaning of and adding context to officially sanctioned discourses. The petitions by the rural population I discuss here were clearly written by professional petition writers. They were called arzukhaljis, or petition writers. Those arzukhaljis adhered to the semantic conventions, including the specific jargon authorized and accepted by the Ottoman bureaucracy in the framework of the petitioning system. In most cases, the petitioners did not even have the basic skills to review the contents of the petition independently, a fact which curtailed their ability to present their case in full and free manner. Moreover, some petitions were backed by interested parties and were initiated by people who sought to promote their own agendas or those of the group they represented. Hence, there is always a likelihood that the rural population was corralled by powerful urbanites or dominant rural notables to send petitions and did not necessarily send them on its own initiative in a way that represented its independent self-interests and concerns. Those reservations notwithstanding, the rural petitions still contain the kernel of an authentic narrative that can yield important information. First, in the period discussed here, unlike most previous periods, there are abundance of sources, newspapers, official documents, memoirs, diaries, newspapers, as I said, sorry, which allow the historian to examine the facts in the petitions through external sources and go a long way towards historicizing their content. Second, as opposed to Khedival Egypt in the 1860s, which was the focus of Shalcraft's work, the Ottoman system was less strict and oppressive. The rural population could submit petitions directly to Istanbul without being punished for the wording or content, and without forms of censorship other than those required by the rules of petitioning. Third, many of the petitions discussed here were in fact prompted by centralization measures implemented by the Ottoman state and reforms that undermined long-standing practices and customs. So it's a reaction to Ottoman policies. Fourth, the fact that many petitions were sent by telegraph forced the petitioners to get immediately to the point, and such petitions were thus probably less formulaic and closer to reality as experienced by the petitioners. Other than the services of the professional petition writers who helped put the petition on paper, in our case, Arzukhalgis or petition writers who lived in Gaza, operated in Gaza, no other intermediary was needed. And before I move on, here there's another picture of an Arzukhalgi. People from all walks of life use their services. We have many pictures from the 19th century that show clients approaching those Arzukhalgis and using their services. And I just want to show you the difference in the size of a letter as opposed to a telegram. This is a letter by villagers next to Gaza complaining about the tax that they had to pay. And the same letter, the same petition sent by telegraph, it's about a third in its length as compared to the letter, because in the telegraph you had to pay for every word, so every word counted. So all of those facts suggest that the rural petitions in the period discussed were not simple formulaic literary compositions. One of the most striking features concerning the scope and nature of the petitions submitted by the rural population as compared to petitions submitted by urbanites is the limited nature of the topics discussed. The rural population submitted very few personal petitions. They hardly come across a personal petition by rurals or Bedouins. It is usually mass petitions, collective petitions. You can see it by the number of signatures at the bottom. You can see it here, the muhtars. Every muhtar put his signature there, and you have here 6 or 7 villages in the region of Castina, Masmia. Each village had 2 or even 3 muhtars. So as I said, for the most part, it was the muhtar or muhtars of the villages who signed petitions in the name of their communities. Ahali is the term. At times with other leading public personalities, such as the imam or khatib of the community, members of the local council of the village, or members of the tribal leadership. Thus the bulk of the rural petitions were collective in that they were submitted by representatives of any number of villagers and villages. Now, the bureaucratic, social, and economic processes taking place in Greater Syria in the second half of the 19th century were accompanied by a strengthening of the connections between the cities and their hinterlands. In the words of the historian Michel Campus, Palestine was very much a part of Ottoman administrative reforms as well as of the economic trends of the 19th century. The commercialization of agriculture, the incorporation of province and empire into the world economy, the rise of coastal trade, and the commoditization of land. Those gave rise to emergence of a large land-owning class with strong patronage and other ties to rural hinterlands, and the rise of minority merchant communities in the city. In this regard, despite having its unique characteristics and not fully experiences the above development, Gaza played an important role as the economic, administrative, cultural, social, and political hub for its hinterland. There are major differences between Gaza and Jaffa, for example, that Mahmoud talked about earlier. Gaza, to a certain extent, to a large extent, in the second half of the 19th century, was left to play by its own rules. The port was not developed. It did not have a major European investment or activity there, no colonists who settled next to Gaza. So to a certain extent, Gaza was different than other portal towns like Jaffa, Haifa, Beirut, and so on. But it was still a very important center. The social and economic processes taking place in Palestine in the second half of the 19th century intensified the connections between the rural population and the urbanites. We're talking about loans to the rural population, penetration of cash crop economy to the villages, social and cultural ties, and other ties. In Gaza, several prominent families own large tracts of land in the sub-district and exerted their influence there. Petitions from Gaza dealing with issues related to the rural population demonstrate the extent to which the rural population was entangled in the competition among the urban elite, which was deeply and very bitterly divided to an unprecedented extent between two rivaling coalitions, one focused around the Husseini family, the Gaza Husseini family, and the other one, a changing coalition of families who opposed the Husseinis. And the villagers were all part of this issue. The Gazan elite maintained networks of alliance with leading Bedouin sheikhs and village leaders, including social and cultural ties. Its members used their dominance in the administrative council of the sub-district and the fact that Gaza was far from the Ottoman regional ruling center in Jerusalem to carve out iltizams in the sub-district and benefit economically from their influence. The teeth collection in Gaza sub-district too was in the hands of urban notables who controlled Gaza's hinterland and manipulated auctions in their favor. Also, the whole issue of grain export from Gaza, the main export of this region, unlike, let's say, the oranges in Jaffa. So in Gaza, the main issue was barley that was exported to the beer industry in England. And it was all run by notables from Gaza, notable families from Gaza. Now, most of the rural petitions examined here deal with disproportionate or exorbitant taxes, both the usher, the teeth, and the vergi, which is in Hebrew or Arabic is verko, virko. It's a land tax that was introduced during the Tanzimat reforms, which was proportionate to the value of the land. Consider, for example, the following quote from this petition, the one that you can see, was sent by villagers next to Gaza to the Grand Vizier. Quote, presented to you are the dutiful prayers of your servants, the people of the villages of the sub-district of Gaza, who are weak and poor and suffer a great injustice due to the vergitas tax imposed annually on our land. Because of its exaggerated value and according to the just orders issued to abolish injustices imposed on every exploited person, and with the hope of obtaining the mercy of the exalted state, we ask you to abolish the injustice which we suffer and treat us comparably to others in our situation and to our neighbors. A related claim, which often appears in petitions dealing with the land taxes levied on the rural population, concerns the methods used to assess and collect the taxes. Complaints were filed for graft and extortion against the tax collectors as well as Ottoman officials who supervised the collection process. The villagers complained that members of the urban elite were able to control and manipulate tax collection in the district in their favor because they dominated the district's administrative councils. Hence, they were easily appointed multazims in the district by taking advantage of the long-standing iltizam practice, which supposedly was abolished during the Tanzimat, but continued to exist. They attempted to extort as much money as possible from the peasants to recover their investment and at the same time make a huge profit. In addition, they used their connections with Ottoman officials to put pressure on the farmers to yield to their demands or be subject to fiscal and property sanctions or even physical injury. Now, if we look at the rural population around Gaza, it was not monolithic, rather it was divided among several lines. For example, urban and rural population. Some of the population in Gaza, in the city itself, was still rural. Semi-sedentary Bedouins and the sedentary population, landowners and tenants, relative newcomers and villagers whose forefathers had settled the land for many generations earlier, and villagers originally from Egypt as opposed to villagers who migrated within Palestine itself. Moreover, internal conflicts were common among the rural population, primarily over resources such as land, grazing, and water. Despite those internal divisions and various sources of tension, regional connections and cooperation existed among the rural population, even if they did not create a close-knit socioeconomic network. Several factors contributed to bringing together the rural population in the region and possibly even led to the development of a shared sense of regional identity. Some of those factors were new, whereas others had existed before, but were ascribed new meanings and pace. For example, revering notables or pilgrimage to holy places and marriages between villages from different localities were not necessarily new phenomena. However, they were now more common in the second half of the 19th century, given the better security conditions, the improved means of transportation, the development of regional markets as a result of enhanced economic activity, and similar developments. All these extended the villagers' scope of interactions with their peers beyond the immediate locality where they lived, as well as with the urban population, and it's really well reflected in the census, the Ottoman census of 1905, which I work on with Professor Johan Busso from Bochum. Anyway, such pre-existing factors were incorporated into other new manifestations of regionalism. Regional connections between villages were manifested, for example, in joint petitions to Istanbul about common issues and problems. At times, representatives of several villages or even more were associated in a joint petition. The specific of those collective petitions may have been worked out in Gaza, where the muhtars of the villages often met, perhaps in coffee houses, where they spent considerable time discussing administrative, bureaucratic, and fiscal matters involving the local authorities. Hence, the muhtars of a varying number of villages came together and submitted petitions through the post office or by telegraph about issues affecting them all, such as the evaluation of the vergi tax. Also to be considered is inclusion in the same administrative entity. The strengthening of Ottoman hold over Palestine and the gradual influence of the reforms in the second half of the 19th century increased the importance of the regional administrative centers such as Gaza and promoted common activity among the rural population. Beyond the conscious influence of being part of the same administrative entity, a feature whose importance should not be underestimated, this inclusiveness at a time when the Ottoman administration was being reformed and transformed often necessitated cooperation between the villages vis-a-vis the Ottoman authorities on issues such as taxes, conscription, and development plans. This, among other things, found its expression in the submission of joint petitions to Istanbul by the villagers. And the fact that we have postal services and telegrams since the mid-60s really made it easy to approach Istanbul. So we see many more petitions from this period as opposed to the past. There were other manifestations of regional cooperation among the villagers and important nuclei of identification. For instance, the prestige and the influence of prominent individuals who resided in the region and were revered by the local population, and pilgrimages to local shrines and holy graves. In the city of Gaza, for instance, there were several important holy places, primarily the site believed by the locals to be the grave of Sayyid Hashim, the great-grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad, which was renovated by the Husseini family during the time of Sultan Abdul Majid in the late 50s, early 60s. Both a mosque and an Islamic madrasa were constructed nearby and an annual festival took place. Another issue was marriages between villagers from different localities that boosted regional relationship between the villagers in the region. This phenomenon was reinforced in the second half of the 19th century due to the developments discussed earlier and the rapid social and economic changes. Finally, the activities of the Jewish colonies as of the early 80s, in particular the joint aspects of their policies, often brought the rural population together. Word of mouth about the various clashes which occasionally took place between the colonies and the rural population spread rapidly and played a role in crystallizing those inter-village networks. The Jewish influence over the rural population was naturally stronger in regions where this activity was more intensive, such as around Jaffa, and where the colonies developed a close-knit network of relationships that influenced their attitudes and policies towards the rural population in their vicinity. The encounter with people considered by the rural population as foreigners reinforced a shared identity among the villagers who defined themselves in opposition to the colonists who were the others. Thus, similar to the petitions concerning the vergi, there was a mobilization of village representatives in the name of a common cause within the framework of the sub-district Okaza. And the most interesting example I can give is this petition from 1913, after the Zornuga incident. It's very interesting because it involved Revolt and Rishon, which were part of the Kaza of Jaffa, the sub-district of Jaffa, but the villagers who signed it were all from the sub-district of Gaza, because the village involved was Zornuga, who belonged to Gaza, was exactly on the border. And so like 15 Mukhtars came together to protest the Jewish activity. And very interestingly, one tribal group which sat next to the Yarkon River, El Auja River, also joined this petition for some reason. I don't know why. If I'll just try to conclude, bothered the villagers near Gaza, very few things, mostly taxes, new regulations also quite common, misdeeds by officials, and then a few other things. The Jewish activity is really not the focus because there were very few Jewish colonies, only 2 at the time in the sub-district of Gaza, more so near Jaffa. And in terms of the characteristics of the all the petitions by the rural population. So as I said, it's mostly Mukhtars who signed the petitions in the name of the village. Usually the petitions were organized in the nearby city using the Al-Zukhalji services, the post offices, and a lot of involvement with city politics. It's quite unbelievable to which extent the villagers were involved in Gaza's politics. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting and enlightening too. We still have 10 minutes for Q&A or discussion. So the floor is open to the audience. Amos?
Shall I start again? Yeah. In fact, I have several questions, but I'll do this very fast, and I'll try to suggest something. The first question is to Yuval, and I'll connect it to Mahmoud later on. We have problem in quantitative information about the increase of taxation, of how much the peasant pay. We know that the government announced more taxation, but if we go through Roger Owen's book, we see that there isn't much success for the government to get much more. The question is whether you see more success for the tax collector to take it after the Egyptian occupation. And I'm asking that because I think that Mahmoud books is amazing. I downloaded it and read a large part of it. It's really, Mahmoud, the best book written on the subject. But then I have another question. Because if I look at Mahmoud's book, it seems that, okay, there are more willingness to give loans by people from the, like merchants, urban merchants, during the 90s, 20s, 30s especially. And I think that if I get it right, the boost is during the Egyptian control of the country. The increase, significant increase. If I get it right, it might that occurred before. My question is, whether you see that there is connection between, okay, we understand that there is people who wants to give money, but there are also people who get the money. And in the terms that you've mentioned, 30%, there is no willingness to take 30%, more than 30%, because also they pay low. There is no much motivation to people to give it if they think rationally about the outcome of that loan. And the question is whether you see that it's related to high taxation. And I'll take that further, because if we go to land registration, so Mahmoud, you suggest that, and in your book, I see that during the Egyptian period, there was time that someone say, I'm not giving loans without registering land as mortgage, and then the court provided them the approval for that. And my question is whether it was something fairly new. Because what seems to me, at least from a kind of macro view and not from within all the details that you have, the two of you, is that we see under the Egyptians and later on under the Ottoman after the Egyptians, higher levy of taxation by people. It became to be norm, as it was in the Egyptian period, to take later on higher loans. And then you have all the stories of peasant revolts and so on. But then the question comes when you can really register land as a guarantee. And I think, Mahmoud, that if I go through your book, I would go further, because what you suggest is that it started intensively in the 1930s, but I think that the main change came after 1858, where registration was formally, it was not tricky anymore. You could register land on names of non-peasants. And then I would say that at least the end that you said in the 1950s, 60s, most of the lands were transferred. I would suggest that later on that it was a process that started with land registration and it continued later on. But I'm just leaving it open because you have the details, the specific details of that case.
Perhaps we can have one more brief interjection, and then we'll let the speakers respond. Yuval.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've got a question for Yuval. Yuval, I know you concentrated on the petitioners, but I want to ask you if you can tell us something about how responsive was Istanbul to those petitions. And another quick question for Mahmoud. Can you mention a few of the villages that you talked about, that you referred to in your lecture? Thanks.
Okay, Mahmoud. You must unmute. Mahmoud, unmute.
Yeah. First, let us take the question of land registration. Within the villages, especially the villages in the hilly areas of Jerusalem, between Jaffa and Jerusalem, where we have many of these with the olives. Many of these villages had already inherited not the land itself, but the tree itself. It was the trees on the land are considered maybe not formally as yours. So when you have a contract as I said, the selling contract. That means you are responsible for giving me a quantity of olives according to the contract, and then you make sure that if you are the fallah, you cannot deliver. There are some authorities within the village itself, not in the city. The dignitaries of the village will be responsible for making you make your promise. And one of the ways is other dignitaries within the village will put their hands on your trees. So the merchant here, the power of the money, let us say, is that the merchant in Jaffa succeeded to have a network of connection, very powerful connection with the dignitaries, with the sheikh of the village or the nahiya. These are the powerful persons, and through them would assure that all what he wanted would be done. This is one thing. And the other thing, the process, not in Jaffa, but we have it in Nablus, for example, in the city of Nablus, and a little more in the city, in Jaffa itself, that already in the 1830s, under the Egyptians, many of the big families, for example, the Abd al-Hadi family, which is very powerful family, succeeded already to convert the land registered on the state, which was in the tasarruf of the Fallahin, not in the mulk of the Fallahin, has succeeded to convert it into waqf land, of familiar waqf land, and to register on their families.
Yeah, indeed.
This was done, if you want, Domani has explained it very, very, very well. That means the process of owning the lands, private owning, making as a waqf, has already been done, somebody would say illegally. It's not the matter. But when we came to 1858, they immediately registered the land which has been given to them or taken by them illegally. It's to take it illegally is not the question. The question whether the state, the Ottoman state, allowed them to register on their names after 1858, and they succeeded to do it very well. And also these merchants in Jaffa, after the 1858, registered and took over the lands of the villages in many villages. So the result, as I said, became that many of these fallahin became fallahin but without land, because the land is possessed by somebody else who is living in the city.
Right, yeah. Mahmoud, just one thing. What we see, and this is like, okay, I know what Dubani wrote about the waqf for the Ahli, and you mentioned it also in your book. But the question is this: what was the extent of that? Because when I go and see land registration in villages, I see that most of the lands were registered in the name of Fallahin, in small plots. The process that we know from the mandate period, that the peasant only have 30% of the land, it's something that gradually developed after 1858 with a sabotage in registration and in a process because people took much more loans. And the question is, again, why? Why did it take so much loan?
Because they needed the money. This is the question that you refer to, Yuval, about the Virgo, about the taxes. It's not only taxes, also social needs for the money, and they didn't have the cash. The whole society in the 1830s have been converting from one situation to a new one, to a capital situation, which everybody needed money, needed cash. And in the villages, of course, they needed cash, and they needed the money flowing from the merchants in Jaffa, and that's why the money started to go to the villages, and selling. At the end, they will sell their trees, their fields, their lands, and when there
was possibility to register land, but when they had possibility to register land, they could get more loans.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah, of course.
I must say, so that there are other people who want to ask questions.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just fascinated. But
Just the question about the villages which you have asked, please. Yani, most of these villages, of course, yeah, in the nearby area of Jaffa, but we have many villages. If you can, now when you travel in the road 433, they call it, or 443, I don't remember, between the seashore and Jerusalem, all these villages are part of what I am, all of them are mentioned as part of the Jaffa region, not of the Jerusalem region. Yeah.
Yuval? Yuval, אתה רוצה להגיב?
Yes. To Amos, I can just say that I think from the mid-60s, you can really feel the influence of the Ottoman reforms in the area of Gaza. It took, it's the second phase of the Tanzimat. After 1858, you can really feel it. And then you see a massive submission of petitions against this vergi tax, which was the main issue, I think, in Gaza. And it involved, of course, registration of land and the evaluation of land, because the vergi tax was the outcome of the value of the land. So they had to evaluate the cost of the land, and then the vergi was a certain percentage of this value. To Yoav, I wrote a whole book about the responses from Istanbul. They responded, I mean, at least to ask the district to check the matter. That's quite impressive how they treated even really silly complaints. They sent it in the telegraph to Istanbul and asked for the referral. Some issues eventually led to investigations and even to firmans or orders by the sultans. For example, there was a big issue with lands in Jaffa, whether it was mulk or miri. It led to a whole investigation, started from petitions and then led to an investigation committee and eventually to a iradeh, to a sultanic decree about the lands of Jaffa at the end of the middle of the 90s.
I think we'll have to call it a day.
Asher, Philip has something.
Excuse me?
Philip wanted to say something.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to drag out the event too long. It was, I mean, I was thoroughly enjoying the conversation between Mahmoud and Amos as well on those themes. It was a question for Yuval, actually, in relation to petitions. We see quite a lot of petitioning in medieval England, and there's a sense that the petitioners, who could be villagers, are sometimes being led by the nose by lawyers who maybe have their own particular agenda or the way of framing it. And I wonder how far you get a sense of the petitions being framed in the urban centre in ways that perhaps the stated petitioners don't really conceive of the issue. Is there any distortion of that story or the message to reflect either, you know, particular ways of legalizing it or of setting it in a particular political context?
It's a big issue in Gaza because there was like a war of petitions between the two urban camps, the two rivaling camps within Gaza, the Husseinis and their opponents. And each side tried to enlist both villagers and Bedouins to join their petitions, to sign with them against the other coalition. So it's always a big issue, especially if you know that the notables kind of control the rural area, or the issue of taxes, the issue of loans. So you have to know the region very well, and you have to get a sense of what was a real petition or something that really reflected a certain problem that existed among the villagers, and what was a petition that was sent, as you say, by almost by force or by asking forcing or asking the villagers to send this petition. It's a tricky issue, always with petitions, I think, to the Sultan or to the ruler. It's a very tricky problem.
Thank you.
Okay, well then it is time to conclude. Thank you again to our speakers, and thank the discussants as well for their interventions. And good evening to you all. Thank you.